Hi, and welcome back, hopefully, to part two of the video. I really appreciate you taking the time to make up our lost class time by viewing these videos. And in the second part of lecture, I am going to talk about anti-Catholic and anti-Irish exclusionary impulses. And this is actually the title of the PowerPoint we're going to start with, Anti-Catholic and Anti-Irish Exclusionary Impulses. And one of the points that I want to make is that United States conceptions of religious pluralism and the right of conscience were very much shaped by anti-Catholicism, with anti-Catholicism facilitating the construction of the close relationship between liberal democracy and Protestantism. When I said that one of the themes was that nativism was a way for people to construct and create their own identity, to define themselves, this is one, I think, example where Catholicism operated as an institution against which United States liberalism can define itself. And by United States liberalism, I mean the tendency to put the idea of an autonomous, free individual at the center of political, social, and economic concerns, which we see the economic version of when we talk about free labor or freedom of contract. But in terms of anti-Catholicism, as I say, Catholicism operated as an institution against which United States liberalism could define itself, could create kind of its own meaning. And you can see some of this in a novel by Catherine Maria Sedgwick titled The Linwoods, or 60 Years Since in America, published in 1835, at a time when anti-Catholic feelings were reviving. They had certainly been there during the American Revolution. They were there in the early 19th century, and in the mid-1830s, there are several incidents that also suggest it is, I don't know that it really goes away, but there are times where it becomes more influential in shaping people's ideas of Americanness. So you can see from this quote on the PowerPoint, Catherine Maria Sedgwick wrote, "It has been justly said that the seeds of our revolution and future independence were sown by the Pilgrims. The political institutions of a people may be inferred from their religion," Sedgwick claims. "Absolutism as a mirror reflects the Roman Catholic faith." Absolutism, right, meaning a very structured political hierarchy with somebody holding absolute power at the top. And Sedgwick argues that democracy, on the other hand, would, quote, "harmonize with the independent and republican spirit of the religion of Christ, the only authority the Pilgrims admitted." And this formulations of Catholic intolerance and persuasiveness were a vital component of United States political culture and ideas of individual freedom. So that the close relationship between liberal democracy and Protestantism is most clearly evident in anti-Catholicism. Moving on to slide number 7, titled "The Frontier and Anti-Catholicism." I thought this would be a good flip side to look at. You know, in the first unit, I talked about the 1862 Homestead Act that provided a certain number of acres of land for farmers. Right? If they lived on it, if they improved it, if they grew crops on it, they could have the land for very cheap. The flip side of this, in a sense, was the concern and anxiety that people had about the frontier. If you remember, I slapped up in Unit 1 two contrasting quotes. One showing great hope about who would settle on the frontier, and the other demonstrating anxiety about this. And that author of the anxiety-ridden vision was Lyman Beecher, who wrote A Plea for the West in 1832, which linked Catholic strangeness and Western vulnerability together. So that the Catholic subject for Beecher and other nativists threatened the promise of frontier liberty, because they argued they were all too ready to sacrifice rational individualism to church hierarchy. And you can see from these quotations that he very much feared Catholic influence. And one of his arguments was that even though the numbers were small, because they would in effect be a block, supposedly controlled as a unit in unison, that they would wield influence beyond their numbers. And you can see that when he says a tenth part of the suffrage of the nation, again, a small minority, thus condensed and wielded by the Catholic powers of Europe, so that 10% is unified, might decide our elections, perplex our policy, inflame and divide the nation, and in effect wreak havoc and end the American experiment in democracy. And as the article suggested that we read for last week, environmentalism was the way in which Beecher understood this issue, where this was kind of a contest that would be played out literally on the American landscape, in the spaces of the American West, in urban spaces in the East, where it was necessary to create institutions that would turn Catholic subjects into good Republicans. And so Beecher called on Protestants, for instance, to establish schools in the West to counter this supposed influence of Catholic priests and bishops. And you can see that in the last quote on the PowerPoint, where he says, "Let the Catholics mingle with us as Americans and come with their children under the full action of our common schools and Republican institutions, and the various powers of assimilation. And we are prepared cheerfully to abide the consequences." So that's one reason why there's so many battles about public school during this period, about using the King James Bible, for instance, about parochial schools, and about whether state funds should be used for religious private schools. That environmentalist viewpoint makes those questions crucial. Moving on to the next PowerPoint slide, titled Mob Violence, Gender, and Anti-Catholicism. I'm going to here discuss in part how ideas of proper gender roles were threatened by presence of Catholic convents in the midst of communities or outside communities that define themselves as Protestant. One of the more famous incidents in Massachusetts around Boston in the 19th century was the attack by a mob on the Ursuline convent outside Boston in 1834. This attack signaled an upsurge in anti-Catholicism and served as something of a model for escalating popular demonstrations against popery and against what demonstrators called priests' prisons. This attack happened for a couple of reasons. One was Rebecca Reed's 6 months in a convent, a supposed expose of this Ursuline convent in Charlestown, Massachusetts, very, very close to Boston, just on its outskirts. Reed described this convent as a prison with young girls forced into Roman Catholicism, with severe punishment and restrictions for those who refused. And works like Reed's functioned as exposés that claimed unnatural, indecent behaviors were going on behind convent walls. In particular, that improper and unnatural gender roles and arrangements were the norm, so that they were these islands of immorality, of abnormality. One particular concern that anti-Catholic protesters had was that these institutions were a haven for Mariolatry. I say on the PowerPoint that there was the claim of Mariolatry. And this cult of the Virgin Mary, anti-Catholic protesters claimed, gave earthly women too much power. And so in 1834, on the day before the attack, actually, Lyman Beecher, who wrote A Plea for the West that I just discussed, delivered 3 anti-Catholic sermons, each to a huge congregation in 3 different Boston churches. The next day, a mob of 60, accompanied by 2,000 speculators, marched to the Ursuline convent outside Boston, sack it, burn it to the ground. 12 nuns, 3 servants, and 47 students have to flee. Unlike later convent burnings, nobody seems to have died in this particular attack. And there is a trial afterwards. Nobody is convicted, and the Ursuline community is never given money or anything. There's no compensation for the actions of the mob. But one of the things that the trial does is it showed how gender roles were very much a concern for the protesters. And in fact, the victims, like the Mother Superior of the convent, are really much more treated as guilty parties during the trial themselves. Mother Superior is described as a, quote, woman of masculine appearance and character, high-tempered, with stubborn, imperious will. And she is called on during the trial to explain the political and familial hierarchies that ordered the Ursuline community. What you had was kind of a collision of 2 different family structures. On one hand, Protestant patriarchy, and on the other hand, a Catholic ecclesiastical hierarchy. And many anti-Catholic propagandists attacked this ecclesiastical hierarchy as one that severed women's, quote, natural bonds to male family members. Now, you might think of a natural congruence and similarity between the norms in a convent and antebellum gender ideologies. Both both gender norms in the convent, as well as antebellum ideas about gender, demanded of women the virtues of piety, of purity, domesticity, humility, and submissiveness. But there was a conflict in that the convent required those attributes to be realized in the context of single-sex communities that tended to separate women from the various family relationships with men that constituted the essence of female status in other places in the United States. So while there were the convents were ultimately under supervision or under the authority of men. The supervision exercised by priests and bishops they considered to be both, quote, foreign and unnatural. And so anti-Catholic propagandists attacked the convent system as one of religious discipline that was destructive of all domestic and social relations. And as I say, severed the natural bonds that should tie people together. This may have particularly alarmed working class men whose own status as domestic patriarchs was being undermined. You remember in the article, the response by Kenny to Noble's article, he kind of elaborated on some of these large forces that were undermining male working class authority, artisan authority. And so imagine these convents as a place of where kind of a very different idea of gender relations is existing, in which men and men's authority is unclear or deemed unnatural, stands out as places of anxiety and concern. And I think something important to note is that this all occurs before the Great Potato Blight, before the famine, before Irish immigration really goes up very significantly in the 1840s and 1850s. And I am going to stop there and leave the rest, including the Know Nothing Party and a discussion of Irish servants, for next week. But I didn't want to overlook these topics. And as I say, I think some of the things I've discussed today will show up again in different form later in this unit, particularly the idea that societies in rapid change, they might seek to disassociate themselves from other groups as a way of defining themselves, that those two things often go hand in hand. And I hope this has been useful. As I say, I will speak more about Irish immigration and the Know Nothing Party and Irish servants in class next week. Thanks.